Ash, please.
Okay. All right, so it's great to be here. I often like to start with a question. I like to know how many of you are already familiar with either lean startup or running lean prior to this talk. So about a third of you, and I find that's always the magic answer, is about a third of any audience is familiar with lean startup. So that's good. So what I want to do is do a quick walkthrough of what this running a lean process is really about, and then we'll just kind of take it from there. I want to get through some slides, and then really I'm all about interactive conversation, so we'll try to take as many questions as we can, time permitting, and if you have more questions, find me afterwards. So by way of introduction, I'm not big on introductions. I just tell people I'm first and foremost an entrepreneur. And I hate to be ending this keynote or ending this conference with a keynote that has such a downer message, but I promise I'll have a more upbeat message at the end. But this is the sad reality. Most products fail. Most startups fail. And even though a lot of this stuff came out from the startup world, we see a lot of these same patterns applying to just new products in general. Products in general, whether in a big company, in a startup, they all fail. Now, there was a study that was done in Silicon Valley that studied this failure. And what they found out is that the number one reason why products fail is not because they fail to build what they set out to build, but because they waste needless time, money, and effort just building the wrong product. And so that's what we really want to fix, and that's what we really want to address. And so I'm going to talk about 3 reasons why this happens, and then we'll talk about some solutions to them. So the first one, and this is the number one reason, is that we fall in love with our solution. And when I say we, I'm looking at all of you entrepreneurs. We have this crystal clear idea that hits us, but we fall in love with the solution, and we race to build that, and that is oftentimes where we go astray and build the wrong product entirely. So we build the wrong product, not focusing on the right customers and markets. Down below, I have this quote by Mark Zuckerberg. This is something that he said not when he was starting Facebook, but years later after he had built a fairly successful company. But back then, even he didn't think he was building a real company. He thought it was just a side project that he did in his college dorm, and one day he would grow up and start a real business. So even for him, this was an accidental thing, what he called awesome in the solution box. That's what a lot of entrepreneurs also kind of harp about. That's what they're really in this business for. Now, how does this happen? So when we get this crystal clear idea, it comes to us in this single clear thought that we should go build this thing, but we can deconstruct the idea into some component pieces. At the very lowest level, we have the vision. Then we have a strategy, which is how we go implement that vision. And at the very top is the product. But the mistake we make is we run up this pyramid and we rush to build the product first, not necessarily taking the time to really distill down the vision or the go-to-market strategy. So almost looking at Facebook, Facebook didn't even have a unique vision, even though their vision was a strong one, connect everyone on this planet. They were not the first. They were number 12 or 13 in line. The reason they won is because they had a really killer strategy for how to roll out their social network. So you have to really think about not just the product, but these foundational layers as well. Now, the other reason that this stuff is hard is that product development itself gets in the way. If I ask you how many of you want to build a great product, all hands will go up. But the way we build those great products is a little bit not so good. And if we look at this picture, it kind of explains why it's not so good. So the way we traditionally build products is we go and gather requirements. We then go build something. We do some quality assurance or some testing. And then we launch it out to customers. So going back to my earlier statement that the number one reason why products fail is not because we failed to build the right to actually build what we set out to build, but because we build the wrong products because we failed to find the right customers and markets for those products. If we look at this picture and look at where customer learning happens, it only happens at the tail ends of this release cycle. So in the very beginning, we're gathering some requirements, and only when we release something do we really learn whether we have built something valuable or not. There's this big middle where we spend lots of time, building product. We're learning about product development, so don't get me wrong there, but we aren't really learning about customer risk and market risk, and that's where we really go astray and either build too much or build the wrong product entirely. And that's something we want to avoid. We want to get rid of that big middle. The third reason is we pay a lot of lip service to listening to customers. How many of you have heard, go talk to customers, they'll tell you what to build? Anyone who has tried that, and I've done this many times prior to being exposed to this methodology, and I would very much sympathize with this statement here. There's Henry Ford quote about how you can't talk to customers because they can't tell you what to go build. But what we fail to realize that even in this code, there is a hidden gem of a message. What the customers are really telling us is not so much what to go build, but they're really describing what their existing problems are. So in this case, they're telling us that they're unhappy about their existing solution, which happens to be a horse, and it happens to be a slow horse. So if you, the entrepreneur, can go fix this problem, then you will get their business. And so Henry Ford, back in the day, could have literally invested in genetic engineering and solved that problem, but he found that it was a much more viable path to go mass produce the automobile. So that's something to keep in mind. And the best way to kind of sum up the message of that is this Steve Jobs quote. So it's not the customer's job to know what they want. That's really all of our jobs as the entrepreneur. From the customer, the best that we can do is help to understand their worldview, help to understand their mindset, and then go build the right solution to then deliver on that particular problem. So now we get a little bit more into the practical and tactical stuff. So I mentioned before that I'm an entrepreneur. I wouldn't be an entrepreneur if I didn't have at least one slide with my book, and I promise I'll have more than one slide, so that's just what entrepreneurs do. And by the way, there are lots of books still laying around, so if you haven't picked up one, you should go grab a copy. They're actually right here now. So so I guess what I want to do now is really summarize the ideas that are in the book, because we obviously can't spend the whole time. We did a whole day workshop today, so we can't spend as much time, but at least share with you the meta principles that the book kind of encompasses and talk about what are the big ideas in it. So I'm going to talk about what are those high-level meta principles. I'm going to talk about how you systematically build products, and then we'll share some very rapid-fire case studies to show that this is not just for high-tech startups, but there are lots of other people applying these kinds of techniques. So let's start with the first one. So the first meta principle to keep in mind is that it's very important to document your initial vision, right, or document your plan A, with the realization that it's going to change drastically. But you still need to document it, because as entrepreneurs, we are especially gifted at creating these reality distortion fields. We can convince ourselves, no matter what's happening, that we're always on the right path. So if you launch a product in the summer months and it doesn't sell, it's obviously not your fault. It's because everyone's on vacation. Well, when they come back in the fall, it's probably because they're just coming back and maybe their kids are getting back to school, and then the holiday season starts, and so we can always rationalize bad news, and we want to avoid that. So you have to really draw a line in the sand, and the best way to start doing that is by documenting your vision, or what we would traditionally call the business plan, and now we kind of use this new term, the business model. So how many of you have written a business plan before? Show of hands. Okay, quite a number of people. How many of you enjoy the process? One, okay, there's always one. Okay, there are actually more hands here, 3, 4. So those guys like torture, but I would say that the business plan writing exercise is a good exercise for the entrepreneur, because it gets you out of that solution thinking box. You're not just thinking about, I'm going to build a great product and magic will happen. You're actually starting to think about who my customers are, my go-to-market strategy, all those things that go into a business plan. The problem I find is that the people who make you write that business plan, typically investors for money, don't take the time to read the entire plan themselves, because they know it's just a work of fiction. They know it's numbers you made up, it's facts that you made up, and until you don't have paying customers, all of that stuff is not probably going to happen as you say it will. So they're not going to listen to the full business plan or read the full business plan, but they do want you to come into their office and give them a 10-page slide deck or a 1-page executive summary, because that's something that's faster and more concise, and it summarizes all those weeks of effort. So that's the problem that I have with it. If you're going to write such a big document that's just going to go for waste, why don't you start with something smaller to begin with? And that's where this idea of the one-page business model, comes to mind. And so the one-page business model, I'll kind of just jump to what it looks like. This is the lean canvas format. It's a derivative off of the original business model canvas by Alex Osterwalder. And I made some changes. I'm not going to highlight the changes here. I'm happy to talk about them at the end if people have questions and what those were and why I made those changes. But if you've ever done a business plan before, you'll quickly recognize a lot of the building blocks here. So it's got things like who your customers are, what problems are you solving, what channels do you use, how do you get to them, what are the revenue streams, what are the cost structures. So you can actually tell a whole business model story using this canvas. Now the power of the canvas is that it's a lot like playing with Lego blocks. So it's got these pieces that you can put together, and you can do some brainstorming, and you can build some pretty amazing stuff. You can build very simple things like this, just like we can with Lego, or you can build some pretty amazing business models, all by playing with the same building blocks that everyone has. So who are your customers? What problems do you solve? What are the channels? And all those kinds of things that go into that. The other power of this is that it's a very portable document. So once you get familiar with the format, it takes you 20 to 30 minutes to write this instead of the 2 to 3 weeks that you would writing a traditional business plan. So it's very fast. But the biggest value that you get out of it is that if you show it to someone, they can't help but read it. If I put it on a slide and I've got this filled out, you can't help but read it. If you're an investor, advisor, team member, you can't help but have an opinion, and that's where the true power lies in this model, is that those conversations that you have is where you learn. That's where you get either criticism or feedback or risk identification, and those are the things you should go and tackle. And so those conversations are very healthy. I highlight this solution box here because the original business model canvas did not have one. I felt that was not doing a service to, it was doing a disservice to entrepreneurs because we want to talk about our solution. So we need to have it, but I made it purposefully very, very small, because that's something that we all know how to talk about. If you bring an entrepreneur here, and we saw some of this yesterday, we love to talk about the solution above everything else, and we'll spend a disproportionate amount of time doing it. So this was my way of saying, don't spend as much time on your solution, spend more time on all these other things, because that's what matter to the other audiences more than us, the entrepreneur. So the big epiphany from all of this, at least for me, coming from a technical background, was that the product that I was building was not really what I would consider the true product of a startup. The true product of a startup is building a working business model. And that's when I began to codify a lot of what you see in the book and the meta principles, because I applied the same techniques that I did to building complex products to building my business model. And so the second meta principle just falls out of that product development playbook. If you had 6 months to build a complex product, you wouldn't start out with what's easiest, because you know that stuff you can do at any point. You would start out with the riskiest parts of that product, so that when month 5 comes around, you're not thrashing like crazy. Well, when we build our businesses, we throw that logic out the door, because we often start out with, guess what? We go into the lab or bring up the computer and we start building something. And that's not usually the riskiest thing. I'm not saying there aren't complex products, but given enough time, money, and effort, and the access to the internet and cloud computing, all these resources we have, open source, we can build almost anything these days. So if you can get over the technical feasibility hump, which is definitely the first leap of faith you have to get over, the next big question you have to ask yourself is, if we build this, will anyone care? And how can we test that? Can we go out there and test that today before we even build? And I'll talk about some techniques for doing that. So also, when I talk about risk mitigation, I define the entrepreneur's job fundamentally about risk mitigation. If you get hit by this great idea and you want some co-founders to come and join you, well, guess what? You are mitigating risk for your co-founders. You're telling them, quit your stable job and come and join my cause. And so you basically have to mitigate risk around your idea or your startup. Same thing happens when you're trying to get investment. They're not in the business to just give you money for charity. They're in the business for one reason and one reason alone, and that's to get a return on investment. So they're going to look at you as a risk profile. If I'm going to give you X amount of dollars, you have to give me 10 of that, 10X of it back within a certain time frame. And so they're going to be looking at you from that lens. When you're looking for customers too, they have lots and lots of options. Even doing nothing, by the way, is an option. So they're going to be looking at, why should I go with you and change my behavior? Because you're a new startup or you're risky, so you have to de-risk it for them. So as entrepreneurs, that is ultimately what we do. And so we can use that to now begin to define the true job of an entrepreneur. So the true job of an entrepreneur is not falling in love with a solution and just building that solution out, but rather turning that solution into a question mark. So I'm not saying compromise on your vision, have a big vision, but find incremental, fast ways to go test out that vision. Because what you will finally build, and time again, you can look at all kinds of examples from Groupon to PayPal to Flickr, they start with one idea, but they end up in a completely different place. So don't fall in love with the final vision, fall in love with the customer segment or the problem that you're solving, and figure out the solution incrementally. You similarly want to turn everything on that canvas into a question mark, because really nothing is for certain. You can't take anything on that for granted. You have to go and systematically test everything. Now, trying to test everything at once is overwhelming, and so the next part of this process is systematically going around this canvas and testing or de-risking your startup or your product over time. We do this through a series of conversations. I show conversations with your customers, and there's a whole vocabulary that we can use. You can go and observe them. You can use problem interviews, solution interviews. They're like scripts for doing these kinds of things to understand who your customers are, what their pain points are, and build products that they actually want to buy. And you can test these kinds of things. There's conversations you have with your team around metrics, around making progress. So it's no longer we're just going to build this product and we hope it works. You can actually measure a lot of this stuff along the way. You can use those same kinds of metrics to talk to your advisors, talk to investors who tend to be more growth, and advisors tend to be more domain expert driven. But you can use, again, that same vocabulary to start having some meaningful conversations, different conversations with them to help systematically de-risk your product. I even put conversations with competitors, because we do have conversations with competitors. They're not nice sit down over lunch types of conversations. They're more marketing and positioning and pricing conversations. So if you launch a product, inevitably someone's going to react to it. They're going to either build something that's very similar to yours or something that's better than yours. They're going to raise prices, play with pricing. So all those things are conversations you have with them. But I leave that one till the end. So I don't talk about that early on, because I find too many entrepreneurs pay attention to who they think their competition is too early, and that's a big mistake. That is predicated on the fact that we know our competition, but if your competition is another startup like you, and you're trying like crazy to anchor and position against them, and you're both clueless because you're not talking to your customer, you're just going to both build a different product, but a very different wrong product. So you want to avoid that, and the best way to uncover who your competition is not by guessing, but just asking your customers. If you go to your customers and lay out the problems you're solving, ask them a simple question, a follow-up question, which is, how do you solve this problem today? If your competitors' names come up, then by all means, they're your competition. And if they don't come up at all, then for all intents and purposes, they do not exist. So you have to figure out what are their existing alternatives today, which, again, there always are. As I mentioned before, doing nothing is an alternative as well, and a bad one. So you want to figure out what it is that they are doing today about this problem, and how can you now anchor, position, price against that. Okay, so the last meta principle here is one of running experiments. So the first one, document your plan A. Much like building a house, you have to have a blueprint. Then figure out what is the riskiest part of the structure and start testing that first. May not be solution, maybe something else. And then you want to run experiments to quickly mitigate those risks. Test for them, mitigate them, and then kind of figure out what's the next highest risk here. So if you haven't noticed, I've been using terms like experiment and hypothesis maybe in the past. That's because a lot of this stuff is baked in the scientific method. And so I'll define what an experiment means. For those of you that are familiar with the lean startup methodology, you'll recognize this picture that Eric Ries drew almost 4 years ago now, maybe a little longer. This codifies an experiment. One cycle around this loop is an experiment. So it starts at the very top with some ideas that we have. We turn those ideas, we build them into some aspect of a product. It could be a full product, could be a partial product. We put that in front of customers, and then we measure their reaction. So we can do that either qualitatively through face-to-face interviews, usability tests, those kinds of things, or quantitatively through metrics. We use that data to then inform our learning, which then kind of repeats the loop over and over again. So this is no different from the product development life cycle I showed you. The one big difference here is that that's only one loop. So in a traditional product development cycle, we would have an idea to go build something. We take 6 months to go build it, put it in front of customers, find out that maybe they didn't want that, and then we spend another 6 months to fix that problem. A very expensive way to build products. This approach is a much faster way. So there are 3 attributes that you want to keep in mind. The first is speed. So in that 6-month period, instead of running one big iteration to go build one product, how about if you can fit 6 iterations in there? So you can build something and put it in front of customers, measure, and then come back and course correct. What if you could do 60 or 600? There are companies like Facebook and Google that push code to their live servers something like 50, 60, 100 times a day, and they do this because of this need for rapid iteration and rapid testing. Now, the end of this loop, they all have to end in customer learning. It's not enough to just build a great product. You have to build a great product and validate that customers actually think it's a great product or not. Even that validation is valuable in knowing what to do next. So it's, again, in the 3-month period or 2-month period, depending how long your cycles are, it's not enough just to build something. You have to build, measure, and learn. Then finally, something I talk a lot about is focus. You have to be focused on the right kinds of things, otherwise you run into all kinds of traps. And this picture will kind of summarize some of those traps. So if you don't have speed, learning, and focus, if you're just going fast and you're focused, but you're not learning from customers, the image of a dog chasing its tail comes to mind. So that's where you're just running around in circles, and maybe something is working, maybe it isn't working, but you're randomly trying a whole bunch of stuff. If you aren't going fast, this one is obvious. You will either run out of resources, or you will validate the business model just enough to where a competitor will enter the market and say, thank you very much, we'll take it from here, and they will take over the market from you because they'll outpace you. And the final one, and this is a trap that we see with a lot of funded companies and bigger companies, but I find this even to be, this premature optimization trap to even be prevalent with like technical founders and marketing folks. And the idea here is that you tend to over-optimize things that maybe don't need optimization yet. So if you're a developer, you might be obsessing about scalability because you want to scale to 1 million users. Well, today you have 0 customers. When you launch, maybe you will have 10. But it's not going to be 1 million overnight. And we know from the stories of YouTube and Twitter, even with the massive failures along the way, they still manage to survive and they still manage to scale up to those needs. So if you build something really great, you will have all kinds of opportunity to scale up. On the marketing side, again, you might be prematurely optimizing your landing pages, but if they're not, if you only have a little bit of traffic, you're going to get diminishing returns at some point. So all those are examples of premature optimization that you want to avoid. So when you build your experiment loops, you want to focus on speed, learning, and focus to balance the 3 to find that optimal learning loop. So this is what the methodology looks like. It starts on the left and goes to the right. So you start with your vision, identify what's riskiest, run experiments, and then there's a feedback loop from right to left. So the experiments are going to inform your risks, which will then potentially inform your business model. In the beginning, your business model will go through drastic thrashing. So a lot of it will change, and then it begins to stabilize, and then you begin to run experiments to scale and do those kinds of things. So I'll talk about what that process looks like next. So it's again, not enough to just build a product kind of following that process, because there's different strategies and different goals at every stage of the product. So when you're first starting out, the first goal that you have to keep in mind is this problem solution fit stage. The thing you're asking here is, am I building something that's worth building in the first place? So life is too short. This is one of my taglines. Life is too short to build things nobody wants. And so you have to really be very careful with your time. You have to make sure that anything you're going to go do is worth that time. So ideas are cheap, but acting on them is very, very expensive. A startup can easily take years of your life. So for any startup to go from ideation to any kind of meaningful exit, we are talking years. So you have to be pretty committed with that particular idea. So that's what the first stage is about. And interestingly enough, we can do this without building anything. So I run boot camps twice a year, and one of the ground rules is that you have to go through problem solution fit. So you have to find paying customers for your idea without building your product. And it sounds very counterintuitive, but we can actually do it if we realize that customers don't really care about your solution. They care about their problems above everything else. So if you can nail their problems and then show them enough of the solution using this concept of the demo, you can then be able to test all kinds of things. You can test pricing, you can test your channels, and you can get enough customers to give you permission to go to the next stage, which is actually build this product out. And so that's what the process looks like a lot. So don't build a product, instead build a demo of the product. Make the demo look as real as it needs to be to the final product, and go test that. So that's the basic message here. Now, if you think about it, you're going to have to do this work anyways. If you're going to design your product, you're going to have to do screenshots and mock-ups and all kinds of things. I'm asking you to do that work, but don't go overboard. Don't actually build the thing to work, because customers don't need to see it working. They just need to see enough of it to where they can imagine it working. It's also pretty dangerous to go and promise lots of things to customers. I mentioned speed is very important. So when you're building these demos out, there's a natural process where customers start asking for more things. And so you begin to pile it up with features, but then you have to take the reverse approach and start trimming it back down. Because what we want to do is come up with this core essence of what the minimum viable product is about. So we want to build the smallest thing possible, which is my definition of the MVP, that delivers customer value. So if you understand what your customer's must-have problem is, what is that minimum feature set that you can get away that still adds value to them, that still makes them pay for your product? So I'm a big fan of charging from day one. I don't believe in hiding behind alpha and beta labels. If you're building an MVP that's going to deliver value to customers, by all means, you should capture some of that value back, which is just a fancy way of saying that you need to get paid from day one, or at least talk about pricing from day one. Now, once you can do all of this, you then move into the second stage, which is all about testing for product market fit. Now, the key message here is that you don't need lots and lots of users to learn. You just need a few good customers. If we look at Facebook, Facebook was able to get massive valuations, not by launching Facebook to the billions of people that they have today, or billion plus people, but by doing this on college campuses with uncanny accuracy. So they could go into any college campus. They got really good at this, where within 30 days, they could get 80% of the college population using Facebook almost daily. And it wasn't happening on just one or two campuses. It was happening on all of them. And they could do this like clockwork. Within 30 days, they would just fire up a campus and they would be able to do this. And that's why behind closed doors, investors were giving them lots and lots of valuation. And for us from the outside, we thought these investors were smoking something because it didn't make any sense. They did the same thing with companies because they might have had the leap of faith that Facebook is only being used by college students. Could it actually be used by an older crowd? And so they did the same thing with companies, and they were able to do that same kind of they basically got those same metrics, and the valuation jumped through the roof yet again. So that's an example of how you can systematically roll out and do things in stages and de-risk your product, make it work, and then worry about scale, which is really what the third stage is about. So first get the product right with a small scale sample of users, and then worry about scaling. So this is where all the growth hacking stuff that you might be reading about comes into full effect. How do you really grow this product from here? So what I want to kind of end with are a few rapid-fire case studies to give you a kind of a flavor of what running lean really looks like. So as I show you these case studies, I'm not going to do a full extensive one, but I will at least try to cover many different domains so that you see that being applied. But the biggest objection that I often receive is if I show you a B2C case study, people will say, I can see how it worked there, but it will never work over here because I'm doing B2B. So it never really works for you, and that's the biggest objection I get. So afterwards, if you do have if you do have a vertical that I haven't covered and you're wondering how you might apply some of this rapid iteration there, come and talk to me and we can have a conversation about that. So the big kind of underlying reason for that objection is people think that every business is different. And I would actually challenge that and say that every business is actually the same, or every successful business is the same, because they do one thing very well, which is they deliver customer value sustainably. So the goal of every business is to do this, and if anyone disagrees with that, I'd like to have, again, a side conversation with you about that. So whether you're in B2B, enterprise, not-for-profit, if you can sustainably deliver and capture customer value, you've got a valuable business. You've got a successful business. So if you focus on that side, every business is actually more similar than they are dissimilar. So let's talk about how we can run lean with many different kinds of products. Well, the first one is actually the book that I wrote. So I wrote this book in a very unconventional manner. So I never had a plan of writing a book. I was writing a blog. I had a few readers begin to ask for a book. And so I went through a lot of the same process. Actually, chapter 2 in my book is a case study on how I wrote the book using all the principles in the book. So it's very meta-recursive. And so after I wrote the book, I went back and documented that case study because it illustrates a lot of those concepts. So if you do have the book, I recommend going to chapter 2 and reading through that in more detail. But the whole idea there was that writing a book is a massive undertaking, much like building any product. And so I came up with an MVP, which was initially even before the MVP, I did a bunch of demos using the table of contents for the book, doing smoke tests, trying to see if people were really interested in the concept. But when I got to writing the actual book, I taught workshops. I went out there because it's a nonfiction book. If you're really teaching something that you're going to write, you might as well start by talking about it and seeing how people react to it. So I used a lot of that time to write my book by way of slides, and by getting feedback from the audience, it made the writing process a lot easier. Plus, I actually had material that was that had already been field tested before I began writing. Now, even as I was writing the book, I released it incrementally in 2-week iterations, much like I would release software, because I wanted to get that small batch feedback loop. So writing a book is a massive undertaking. It's like putting a giant jigsaw puzzle together for those that have written a book. But if you just write 2 chapters, it's easy for you to do. It's easy for your reviewer to read those 2 chapters and give you feedback. So that's what I use to, again, further incrementally deliver this book to my audience and help and get their feedback to make that book a lot better than it could be just me writing it alone. So in many ways, it was kind of crowdsourced into the audience, which is something that you also commonly see. So that would be actually one case study. And then the other one that I'm going to talk about is the restaurant example. So for a lot of people that maybe are in the food business or know someone in the food business, if you've talked to a restaurateur, they're a lot like artists, they're a lot like entrepreneurs. If you ask them about their dream of opening a restaurant, they'll talk about the location probably first. They'll talk about the napkins, the menu, what they're going to be cooking, the ambiance. All those are premature optimization things. Those things kind of matter at the end. The biggest risk when you start a restaurant business is the food. Can you really cook? Do people like your food? Will they come back, not eat it once, but will they come back and repeatedly eat your food? Will they actually pay for that experience? And you can test that in many different ways. You could start a catering business. You could even just have parties in your house and invite friends who can bring other people. And if people are constantly raving about your food and tweeting about it, then maybe you have something that's worthy of turning into a restaurant. So there are all kinds of kind of fast ways of testing whether you can actually start a restaurant in the first place. But the reason I have this picture up here is this is a food truck. And where I live in Austin, the food trucks have become very popular, not as a way to sell cheap food, but as a way for even high-end chefs to go and test their new concepts. So the nice thing with the food truck is it doesn't require a lot of investment. You can rent one of these things. You can get a FDA license in a week or so. You can drive this thing around, so you can test all kinds of locations if you wanted to. And you just start, with things like Stripe and all of this, and Square. You can start collecting credit card payments. And so you're in business within 1 or 2 weeks, and you just start cooking, and that's a very fast MVP. You just kind of start building stuff, and if people like it and they buy it, then you've got something that may turn into a business. So many of these food trucks, this is a cupcake example, they're barbecue places, all kinds of places. Many of them eventually graduate into brick and mortar stores. What's very interesting is that some of them keep the food trucks still around because that is their innovation ground. So in Austin, they now have a food park where you can go and park these things 24/7 and you can have these open all the time. And so these restaurants, they keep the food trucks open because that's where they test their newer menu items. Because trying to put that into a restaurant is expensive and risky because you have to train staff, you've got to put it on the menu, what if it doesn't work? And so by testing it in the food trucks, they can make sure it works, and then they systematically roll it out at larger scale. So that's, again, the idea of product market fit. So you have a new menu item, first test it in small scale in one of these lower risk places. If it works there, then figure out how to scale it to your other 5 locations if you chose to. So that's an example of how you can take the same concept of, in the lean world, of fast delivery, continuous delivery, of MVP, of iteration, and apply it to something like the food business. The last example, and this is an interesting case study, this is the lit motors example. So people always say hardware is really hard, right? So you can't really iterate fast on that. So this is a concept car that was built by these guys. It's half motorcycle, half car. The problem they're trying to solve is that cars are inherently unsafe. Sorry, not cars, but motorcycles are unsafe. And cars have a lot of unused capacity. So people that are single, maybe only using it for commuting, don't really need all the seats, so they'd much rather drive a motorcycle, but motorcycles are not that safe. You can't use it in all weather. So these guys built an enclosed motorcycle. But they put it up, but they souped it up with all kinds of great technology. It's built on this gyroscope technology that was in the Segways, so the thing does not tip over. You can step out of this motorcycle and walk away, and it will not fall over, which is an incredible magic trick just for that effect. But the other thing is it's got all kinds of that intelligence built in, where if it even gets hit by a vehicle, it does not roll over. It kind of stays upright and just skids off the road. So these guys initially did a lot of that kind of promoting. They would have these teaser pages and demos up, and they got a massive email list of people that were interested in the concept car. But at some point, they had to build this thing, because you cannot sell a car without people test driving it. So what you see in this picture is the MVP. So the top half is the finished product. That's the painted half. The bottom half is the kind of Robocop-looking thing, because this is something they built by hand. So the founder said it takes too long to go through the manufacturing cycle. We have to raise investment. We have to find the right partners. Let's build the first prototype by hand. So they got into a lab. Within 12 weeks, they built this MVP. And the way they launched it was very, very interesting. So they went to their mailing list, figured out who their right customer segments would be. They rented a warehouse for the weekend, and they emailed the right people and said, we have a prototype of this car waiting, and it's waiting just for you. So they made it very exclusive. And they said, so that we don't waste your time, you can go on this website and schedule an appointment, and you can come by over the weekend and test drive this car. So it made something that was a constraint, because they only had one car. If you show up to test drive it and it's gone for the day because somebody else is test driving it, it would be a bad experience. So they actually used the appointments as a way to get people feeling like they were being treated specially, but it was really working around their own constraints. So people came over that weekend, they test drove this vehicle around the block a few times, and they were given the option to then pre-order the car and be the first one to get it. And people, actually put money down for this thing, and that's what helped them raise their bigger round of funding and go into production. And so that's what the picture above is all about. So and anyone on their website today, if you go on their website, they are still taking money. So if you want to order this, you can pre-order it even now, and they will put you in different batch queues. So if you want to get it faster than anyone else, you can jump the queue by paying more in your pre-order. So they're still applying a lot of this even today. But I guess where I was going with this example is that this is a concept of the MVP not necessarily being about cheap and fast, because that's where people also get stuck. It's like when they look at hardware, they say this cannot be a cheap MVP. It still took 12 weeks to build. You still need to have professional equipment. These guys did raise angel investing. So they had something like $250,000 raised based on the early traction they got just from their videos and the desire for the product. But the message here is that the idea of the MVP is not about being cheap and fast, but cheaper and faster than the alternative. So in this case, the alternative was going down the manufacturing route, long cycles, going around the investment route, which would be a lot of risk, at least from the investor perspective. And so by going this approach, they were able to de-risk this for the investors, for their partners, and get to actual paying customers, which is what your investors care about the most. That would be what we call traction, engagement with your customers or market. So I remember I said I started out with a downer, so this was the downer message, most products fail. So I'll kind of try to flip that around. So I travel a lot. I spend 1 week a month going around the world. I like to go to new places, like Slovenia is my first time here. So I like to go to new places, get a vibe of what the startup ecosystem is. Now, what I found is that the prototype of the entrepreneur, while we may all speak different languages, we may eat different foods, look different, the prototype of the entrepreneur is very, very similar. We all want the same things. We all fear the same things. And so ultimately, we're actually more similar than dissimilar. I also find that we are living in very interesting times. So I alluded to things like cloud computing, open source, all those kinds of things. We're at a point in time where we have more access to information than we ever have in history. And so even in this room, when I asked how many of you know Lean Startup, 30% of you said yes. And I'll tell you that is the same number I find whether I'm in Silicon Valley or I'm here in Slovenia. It's the same exact number. So you guys are on a level playing field. I wouldn't say that everything is leveled, but I do liken the game of entrepreneurship now a lot to the game of basketball. So if you went back to the 1992 Olympics, this is the dream team that you see up here. They could play with their eyes closed. So they won the Olympics hands down, 44-point spread. But over the years, the game changed, and entrepreneurship just is the same thing. So over the years, different countries upped their game of basketball, and now the gold medal for the US team is not a given. They actually have to work quite hard at it. And so I find the same thing to be true with entrepreneurship. We are living in very interesting times, and the game is there for the taking. It's not just the US game or the few hotspots that are around the world. It's really for the taking for everyone. So if I was to make a prediction, I do think in the next 10 years, we're going to create more entrepreneurs than ever before, and they're going to come from many, many more different parts of the world. So with that, I'll kind of end here and take any questions that you guys have.
Okay, do we have any questions for Ash? We have time for 3 to 5 questions. Okay. Down there.
Oh, okay.
Okay, why did you change the canvas?
I predicted that question. So this is the original Lean canvas. This is the business model canvas. These are the changes. There is a longer blog post where I talk about what these different changes are and what my motivation were. So you could kind of take a picture of that, or just go to my blog and you'll find it. But the biggest reason I found is not so much that one canvas is better than the other, but they are just different paradigms. So I find that the business model canvas, personally for me, is a more strategic canvas. So it uses terms like, what are your key resources and what are your key activities? I was a startup. I had a few key resources, but I wasn't thinking that way. I was more entrepreneurial in the sense that I would go acquire the resources I needed to go build what I had to build. So my canvas is a little bit more focused on the customer problem solution paradigm. So we start out with which customers we want to serve or which problems we want to solve, and then based on that, we figure out what are all those things. The other side of this is that within, in computer science, we use this term, how you can get to anything with just one degree of indirection. So I find that neither of these canvases are perfect. So not any of them is going to answer every possible question. But once you start having those conversations with advisors or investors, either one is good enough at getting to all the core essences that would go into a business model.
Okay, the next question.
Goran, SEO advisor. So we are building a self-service software for search engine optimization. And a very successful company in this field is HubSpot. So do you maybe know what's their secret to success?
Well, I think they'll actually tell you it's the inbound marketing stuff that they actually sell is they eat their own dog food. So from the very beginning, they have been, and Dharmesh and all the others talk about this very openly, how as a software company, they're very much like a publishing company. They produce so much content and they create all these leads which eventually convert for them. So theirs is out there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the next question. Come on. No more questions? Okay. Alex?
What's your opinion about the Slovenian translation? Because it's actually, a lot of people would read and understand English, but we decided anyway to put it in Slovenian language.
Yeah, so I'm very excited. So I was telling a number of the organizers that I love my publisher, but they are really bad at telling me how many translations are out there, and so I oftentimes hear after the fact. But I understood this was a very much of a startup ecosystem initiative, and I think that's very good, because I know that some of these translations have been done just by a publisher assigning a translator, and if it's not written by an entrepreneur, you don't get the essence of what it is you're talking about. And you guys talked about vocabulary and trying to find the right words. So obviously I can understand the book, but I have faith that it will represent the message very well. So I'm definitely very excited.
Cool. And he will take 10 more minutes after the conference to sign the books for all the people who bought the books. If you didn't, you still have a chance to buy it now. Here is Alexis, and we will put the stand here so you can buy the book. You can shake your hand with Ash, and he will sign your book. But now I guess it's the time for the wrap-up. All good things sooner or later come to the end. We had a wonderful 2 days, a wonderful conference, so we will have to do a lot of applauding. First, a big applause for our international guests, for speakers, investors, and all other speakers who shared knowledge, their insights with us, so we could learn from the best. Big applause, please. We had more than 200 people from all over Europe who came to the PODIM conference with airplane, cars, and I think that was first time in the history of Slovenia to have a startup conference, so many international people, so big applause to all the people from foreign countries. I promise you that we will work hard to make Slovenia international startup hub with more and more money, with more and more mentors and other support that you need to build a great company. And even next year we will also bring great speakers that you will be able to learn from. So I guess that is it. If I wrap up the whole 2 days in one sentence, I think it would be think big, do mom's test, and hike to the top of the mountain. So see you next year, and thank you for being here.